but just a huge thank you to Professor Fuentes and Eliza and Lane for being willing to bring this work to us.
Awesome. And so so in this spirit of showing work in progress, being comfortable, sharing process, also crucial information, there's no undergrads other than Punjab who already applied for a grant, but we also wanted to share, how to get funding for research. And another piece that is important to share is that I really love the idea of the labs and the research teams and having a topic, but everybody doing their own thing or going with their interests. I wanted to create more of that in the department, and especially at times where we are I was like, wow, these undergrads are amazing. They are different than in the classroom that everybody's scared and obliged to do things. Mm-hmm. And I learned a lot. One of the from Lane and Eliza. So this is part of URAP, the Undergraduate Research Assistance Project. Initially was one researcher, but I was like, these are great folks, and they let me have two. So we created a team, and they are friends, so they work together even, right? So they created a good buddy system. So we'll talk about what we found and how and what we did. So basically, the project started in 2021. I first applied to the Alumni Award for Curricular Innovation, which for colleagues, you can do that. And I was like, look, end of 2020, there was so much being produced and experimented with in terms of, dealing with pandemic lockdowns and quarantines and stuff. And I said, I don't know if people are archiving this, are documenting this. This is a lot of, shifting, especially in the field of digital performance, which tends to be pretty wide and very niche. And so I was like, well, many things going on digitally and also socially distanced. And this was initially meant as a way of teaching a class around this topic where the students would help create an archive, right? So not just documenting or learning, analyzing, but also curating and preserving works, right? And at that time, because it was tied to a class, it was about how to learn from these artists and create our own performances. We were on Zoom, remember this? So we were like, oh, look at this guy who did a performance in a closet. Pick a closet, use a lighting source, so that the first RA, which was Sydney Tennell from theater, she already graduated. She really compiled a lot of, case studies. People were very much about creating shared Word docs and exactly grabbing, collecting examples. And she also did clusters about how do these theater makers go about these performance strategies in times of a global pandemic. So she had use of physical objects with audience. The objects were shipped or bought, right? So there is a project that is called Showing Without Going, right? And they also collect these examples of, even drawing from genealogies, from Fluxus, Yoko Ono, scores, right? So Sydney categorized different experiments in clusters, audience situated as co or primary creator, performances that attempt to recreate a sense of communal watching, performances that address COVID-related themes, right? Because there is the pandemic, and then there's also the entangled crisis that this time brought to us. So in 2021, our work was around how have pandemic performances adapted to virtual formats, how have these adaptations affected the audience-performer relationship, and how might performance theater may be permanently affected after we return to normal. And you might remember that there were a lot of forums in TDR or, dance research about like people discussing what was this challenge, what did it entail in terms of opportunities and what would it mean for theater itself, right? So I want to show you, can I really quick, let's see what happens. So this is actually the end. This is AI, so we'll get to that. So Sydney created a timeline, right?
To share the screen.
So that's okay.
Sorry.
For everybody,
Yeah.
even in person. Okay. Thank you for that. So yeah, so Sydney, so we're working in Scalar. We'll talk about that later. The
Yes.
good friend and beast of Scalar, which was a platform developed in 2011 and that is used in the digital humanities and performance research quite extensively. So Sydney created a timeline, like events in terms of the pandemic, but also, and the George Floyd summary, how do you call it? Murder, like turmoil, right? And then located performances in that timeline, right? The case studies placed it in the timeline. That's one of the possibilities that the platform allows. The platform also allows to create sort of constellations, which, like you tag your case studies and then create these constellations based on keywords. And these are the case studies she analyzed. She interviewed folks here in the theater department, designers, etc. And then, as I mentioned, she created some strategies or like prompts for students to build from these case studies to create their own performances, which I want to come back to, but we're not doing that this time. Nosizwe Nsipa, who is originally from Zimbabwe, extended the research in the summer of 2021, trying to diversify, as she says it here. She's hilarious. She was like, really great about, like, she says, like, not all pandemics are equal. So, like, she said some people in Africa sit it out. They use the pandemic to develop work. So it's not all like we need to get to Zoom to deal with this time, right? Before we just, so like basically, so then I become DGS and this stops, this pauses when we come back to campus and I'm DGS, Director of Graduate Studies. And then I'm like, okay, now things are slowing down. I can pick up the research project after these 2 cycles. And I applied for the URAP faculty research grant. And Eliza, who is from performance studies, but also minoring in, I think, or majoring, double major in philosophy, interested in dance and embodiment, applied. And Lane comes from theater. She has an interest in playwriting and also comes from like data science.
Cognitive science.
Cognitive science. So imagine, so very interdisciplinary. And she has a lot of skills in terms of, digital platforms, marketing, social media. But the program basically is not for them to work for me to feed my research, but to learn research skills as well, right? So a big part of the project also focus on what is to do research in performance studies, right? Is it about numbers? We don't have a data pool that is huge, but it's more about learning from people, interviews, and particularities, right? And learning from artists. How are they thinking about this moment? Are they like, oh no, that was crazy, it was just a temporary fix, I moved on? Eliza, she's going to talk about it. She interviewed a performer who comes from immersive theater and nightlife culture, so like completely different, and devised a piece that Eliza really focused on, right? So before I pass on to them, I wanted to say you know how working with undergrads is great because all that is abstract and very complicated, they nail it down, they distill it to what matters. And I asked them to write curatorial statements and summaries of what we were doing. And they were like, well, you know, basically it's about elevating the role of the arts in times of crisis, right? And that stays with us. So I like that summary. So we started reviewing scholarship on pandemic performances, the longer genealogy of digital performance, and how performance shifts are being theorized. We also reviewed and implemented analytic methodologies to understand how these works were made, performed, and experienced, and how artists are thinking about the challenges and opportunities brought about by the pandemic. And so what they did was I just want to like pan out some of the activities. They compiled and updated a list of works, drawing from Sydney's initial list. They created timelines, like the one I just showed, particularly, well, Sydney and Lane and Eliza interviewed creators, participated in recreated performances, devised methodologies for reviewing artifacts and digital remnants, crafted audience surveys, and learned Scalar, this multimodal digital platform. Basically, the platform, for me, if the project and the class I'm teaching now, it's about learning about digital performance through digital tools, multimedia tools, because the platform already asks for visual materials, right? It's like, what do you have, right? And that brought insights in research. The moment when we said, okay, at the end of the winter, we have to start working to get to Scalar, right? So we were like, okay, what did you choose? What do you have to feature in this platform, right? As a way of archiving and curating the set of performances they were interested in. For me, it meant speaking with librarians at Northwestern, and I got questions about sustainability, customer service, like if you lose a page, who is around to help you? Security, data security. Northwestern is very serious about that. And because we were like, eventually it would be great to feature this as a library collection, right? So that would be kind of like our next step for figuring that out. So for the 2025 group, one of the questions also was, why study the pandemic now, 5 years later, right? How is this different from the folks writing in 2020, right? And for my particular research, it was sort of like at this moment of post-pandemic polarization and social turmoil, could these performances have a key about things that we were seeking, that was connection, that was gathering? Maybe we should retrace our steps and see if there's something there to be rescued, right? Okay, so I'll pass the baton to who wants to start? You want to start? Eliza?
I'm so good with whatever. If it's easy for me to start so that you can, I don't know, whatever works.
Maybe you guys can reflect for like 5 minutes on just like everything you said together, and then I can do kind of an overview of my case study, and then she can go into hers.
Yeah, great plan.
I think something overall, I just want to say thank you. This has been such an incredible experience because coming into URAP, as a cognitive science major, we talk all about research methods and psychology and like a lot of other kind of more social science fields, but I couldn't really picture what research would look like in the arts and humanities. And it's been really, really cool and also very challenging to go through this process. And I think that the three of us have had some really, really incredible conversations. It's been a very reflective process because I was a sophomore in high school during the full year of COVID lockdown, and now Eliza and I are both sophomores in college. So as we've been working on this project, there's also just been a lot of kind of natural reflection of our own personal experience with the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, I can introduce myself as well. Yeah, I think towards the end, actually, we had a lot of really good conversations about how relevant this was. I think at the beginning, we were sort of curious how it would be relevant. And then I think by the end, we were like, oh my goodness, this is so incredibly relevant, which is kind of a cool reverse process. I guess personally, I the reason that I applied for URAP was because I had a lot of extra time on my hands because I am enduring long COVID. And so I no longer am able to like physically perform in the way that I want to. So to me, I actually found it like incredibly relevant to be doing research in this field. And it was kind of really, yeah, definitely a really reflective process and a way for me to like value that time and see how it relates to the current time I'm in, and also just to think about like COVID and the body and how even though we were using our bodies during that time digitally, like how we're still left with like physical remnants of that time. So yeah, but it's definitely, I agree with Lane, it was challenging to think about how to conduct research in this way. I know Professor Fuentes mentioned this, but like, yeah, thinking about data points not as like specific numbers, but as like interviews and using your critical thinking skills to synthesize those interviews into like, you know, data and analysis. That's really, really human, which I think is really important as we are like increasingly engaging with digital mediums. So to me, it was a really cool duality to be engaging with data that was about having conversations with people. So that was pretty incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I can start by talking about a case study that has been really interesting for me. It was really exciting for us to kind of start with Sydney's research because she built a very extensive kind of list of a huge range of different performances. And I noticed a play called Russian Troll Farm, which last year had a premiere at the Vineyard Theater in New York that I'd heard about. So I was so curious how this play that had an off-Broadway run had also started as a completely digital performance. And that to me started to kind of emerge some questions about how the pandemic could have supported the artistic process of developing a new play. Because in some ways it really lowers the barrier to entry. You don't necessarily need physical space to have a performance of your new work. So I got the opportunity to interview a composer named David Taylor Gomes, who wrote the book and music for a musical called Ranked. It originally started in 2018, 2019 at a high school in California, where they were essentially interviewing students about their experience with like academic pressure. And they ended up creating a musical about kind of a dystopian high school where class rank affects a lot more of your future. Where it's like there's literally a scoreboard and all the students are grappling with that. And they had their like high school production where they created this piece, and then it went to UC Davis, and then they were in the process of casting professional actors for an industry reading in New York that was supposed to be on March 20th, 2020, and it got completely shut down. If you want to go to maybe the first tab.
This one?
Yes. This just was kind of their initial development process. It was and we can actually just go to the second page, yeah. So what ended up happening was they had to pivot very quickly, but they ended up really embracing virtual licensing and digital performance in a way that they weren't really expecting. When I asked David kind of about his process during COVID, I was expecting him to say that it was honestly really positive because this production was able to grow a lot. It got dozens of productions from like 2020 to 2022. But he was actually kind of exasperated talking about it. But ultimately they kind of focused on how like the decision to really push digital licensing allowed them to have so many more opportunities to see how different audiences and different groups of students could interpret their material. And that really helped them with rewrites now that they're trying to push it to more commercial readers after the pandemic. And as part of that, they also started their own virtual licensing company called Upward Theatrics, which is a licensing company that is only submitting scripts online, which in terms of new work development is kind of exciting because it allows playwrights to hear their work, do revisions, and then upload the newest version to the website for licensing, as opposed to working with print and paper. Just because of the logistics of the pandemic, it's hard to distribute physical copies of scripts when everyone's in different rooms. So that was kind of what I was able to learn about with Ranked. Also just some of the meaning of the show took on different layers with the pandemic. One of the songs pre-pandemic that was really popular was called Come Up for Air, but then with the lyrics of that song and kind of the pandemic with wearing masks and also the I Can't Breathe kind of slogan of Black Lives Matter, the song kind of added new layers that were really relevant to kind of the social context that a lot of the students performing the piece were going through. So it was cool to dive into like this specific case study because I was really interested in like process of like the beginning, the middle, and then how something lives on after the pandemic when it could be performed on stage or on computer screens. Yeah.
Stop sharing. Yes, so you see that she started with Russian Troll Farm, who she picked from the compendium we had before, and then you know how it is. All the research in the room know that then you take a segue.
Yeah.
And Lane actually brought up the things that surround the performance event, right? Like play development, rehearsals, collaboration, and then this idea of dealing with manuscripts, right? And what these artists learned, and so they developed a company, a licensing company, right? So like how the practice even changes. Yeah, Eliza.
Awesome. Okay, I can share my screen if that's easier. This is so meta. I haven't shared my screen in such a long time. Okay, can you see my scalar? Okay, amazing. I guess I can just sort of like walk through it a little bit and then focus on the telelibrary, which Professor Fuentes hit on for a second, which was just, I think, the most like fruitful interview experience that I had. Yeah, so this is like my opening page. And then I sort of walk through these 3 different case studies. And then, yeah, I guess, okay, so the telelibrary, I can read this little blurb. It was a piece of one-on-one immersive theater. It consists of a phone conversation between an audience member and an automated system, which is actually voiced in real time by Yannick, who I got to speak to. It's catered to the individual's needs, as the automated voice reminds them the telelibrary is here for you. This work emerged in June of 2020 as a response to the isolation and lack of available human connection during quarantine. The telelibrary presents somewhat of a utopian vision of how AI and technology can serve us and be more human. No coding is involved in the telelibrary. In fact, it's somewhat of an analog approach. Chapman O'Brien types up the comments previous listeners have made about the subject at hand. He uses a Walmart iPod shuffle for the audio he's pulled from other users' calls. The tones of the piece are actually played by him on his ukulele in real time. While the user's on hold, he plays the ukulele as a hold music at the same time as accessing the system he aims to present to the listener. And over here, I began to try to use these visualizations to sort of highlight key terms relevant through my experience with the telelibrary. I guess something to note is a lot of our research process consisted of just like working out Scalar, which was just like a new platform for us. So there was a lot of time spent on figuring out all these visualizations. So I'm still hacking at it, but I think I got closer to like figuring out how it can work for me instead of like, how do you upload this? So yeah, over here I have these tags of these key terms. And I guess, yeah, so like if you click on one, it will lead you to like a little blurb on what liveness is or what I see liveness to be. It's still kind of in the works. I want to have like a working definition. And then I was hoping over here with this like note that these questions of how might liveness be challenged in a time of social distance, how accessible is this autopoietic feedback loop, how might artists in this collection have amplified the importance of such an exchange through their tactics and digital performance. I was hoping that maybe there's a way to comment on these so that if you are working with the Scalar, you can sort of add a comment here. And then we can create this sort of like constellation of conversation on that. And yeah, if we go back to the telelibrary main page, I wrote a personal reflection of my experience doing this phone call. So before I met with Yannick for an interview, I did the performance myself. So I had to dial this phone number and I got to talk to the system for like an hour, which was incredibly cool. And I will say, when I was doing it, I was so confused because I was convinced that I was talking to a robot. And then after the fact, I realized that like there was literally a person on the other end mimicking the voice of a robot. But like actually, I was like, oh my God, I feel so heard by this system. Like, how is he picking up every single like joke I make? And yeah, and it was actually a human being. So I feel like thinking about how these performances might be relevant today, like AI is completely relevant to that. AI will not hear you in the same way that another human being can hear you on a phone call, but the way that Yannick is like pretending to be this AI voice, it's so interesting because you're so surprised by how heard you feel. So that was just like incredible. And over here, I wrote just like a personal reflection on what it was like to do this phone call and the emotions I had beforehand. And then I guess the most fruitful part of it for me was doing this interview, which is about an hour and a half long. So it's super, super long. But he sort of talks about the process. And he goes through sort of like the statistics of these. He keeps track of like how many times users choose this one feature on the call, how many users talk about journaling, talk about gratitude, talk about, so he has all these statistics that he like records in real time to create this sort of like constellation. And I was also just struck by how this emerged during the pandemic, but is clearly still able to be done today and still has relevance because it's live and it's a phone call. And just thinking about the medium of a phone call as like a vessel for performance is just super, super interesting and innovative. So yeah, this is a super long interview and I'm not gonna play it now, but I guess yeah, that was really exciting for me. And I was really interested, as Professor Fuentes mentioned, about like embodiment and liveness. So my case studies sort of focus on that, or like how we orient our bodies and how we think of it not just as like an adapted performance for the screen, but something really for the time and for yeah, that lack of connection, how we can like create that in ways that make us innovative and give us performances that can actually withstand the pandemic and still be relevant today. So yeah. And then I guess like at the end I have some frameworks that are relevant to all of the performances I talk about. But yeah, thank you.
So a couple of things. So, telelibrary, right? So this is a performance in the compendium. It's about calling and Eliza was like, well, but the performance is over, right? Like it's not active at the time, right? When it was active, you could join connect the performer through a website, for example, right? It's not active today. So she looked we were trying to locate the artist, social media, Instagram, DMs, etc. And so I'm like, okay, ask him to reenact the performance, right? That is interesting because he then asked for a fee, like a small support fee, right? I felt, okay, Eliza, undergrad, calling this guy, like, what is this gonna be like, But so they had a great time, and he accepted to be interviewed because part of their also their learning was how to connect with accomplished artists. Like you're an undergrad, you show up in someone's email, is he gonna take you seriously? Right? Like you also did interviews with some professors, some NYU folks, and others no,
Yeah,
right?
and I talked to David, who was the composer of Rain.
Yeah.
And it was so informative to hear about his personal experience developing the work as opposed to just like my interpretation of how it changed.
Yes, absolutely. And then there is a student here who created a company in
Yes.
Colombia during COVID. Do you wanna mention
Yeah,
that?
Mariana, who's one of the MFA directors, she's going to her third year next year. She's just so wonderful, but she started her own theater company during the pandemic back home in Colombia. And now like three of the kind of four main people who started that theater company are all at different universities in the United States getting their MFAs in different fields. One of them's doing costume design, one's doing dramaturgy, she's doing directing here. And they basically just decided to kind of they were all working in other fields and they decided during the pandemic to come together because they didn't have to worry about space in the same way. They could just start creating theater together and start creating community together. They started doing a lot of camps and things for children. And then they started putting up their own productions online and their plans after they finish graduate school to go back and like bring all their skills to an in-person performance space.
Yes, excellent. Yeah. So you can see the interdisciplinarity, right? Like what is a performance studies project? You go with these keywords, liveness, embodiment. Then, she's interested in the profession. She goes out, like play development. I don't know if I mentioned that Lane is interested in playwriting. She got a beautiful internship in New York about that, right? So I'd like to hear, and they learn from each other, of course, and they know, they knows performance studies. She took classes, etc. So they were like, "Oh, this is more like performance studies. This is more like theater, right? Like in a way to think about interest." Things, as I said, a longer. Both were interested in longer genealogies, like Eliza interviewed Thomas de France, our very own Thomas de France, who talked about like. Collaborating through networks and interfaces and signals from before the pandemic, and like his own reading of what is missing in the scholarship or like what people have been focusing on, and then Lane even like codified plays.
Yeah.
Right, to like serve people who might be looking for text that can you say a little more about like remote hybrid, how's that working?
Yes, I found a collection of plays that was published through Drama Display Services, which is one of the kind of main publishers, called the Technical Difficulties Collection. And they all came out in 2020. The last one might have been 2021, but the first one was called Plays for Online Theater, then Pandemic Theater, then Plays for Every Theater. And I analyzed the plays. Each of them have 10-ish, 15-minute plays. They're all very short. One of them is about Zoom bombers, which I thought was such an interesting way to like introduce entrances and exits and like write those into a play when you don't have a space to have people walk onto. But looking at kind of the different themes that those playwrights were grappling with, in terms of just that shift from going to online to something that's more specific to the pandemic, to something that can hopefully live on after the pandemic in various kinds of spaces.
So you see, for example, the way Lane uses tags is themes and characters, right?
Mostly just themes and keywords. I still have to upload all of that.
Yeah, they are like, don't show that. No, but I did notice that, for example, Eliza works on key concepts like liveness, embodiment, and you give us, so like the tagging gives us, so the platform, even though it should have an update aesthetically, right? But it gives us like visualization tools. You can where am I gonna get? But you can see like you
can go to table contents
here.
and then you go scroll over to technical difficulties. And then
you have to tell me because I can't see anything. Is it this?
Yeah, wait. Can I just
This one, yeah.
thanks.
I can't see anything. Yeah.
So like this was one of the plays, and I was able to look at kind of like how big the casts were, if it was written specifically to be performed as like a Zoom play where they're talking about Zoom as a platform. If they're talking about a play that's set during lockdown, and then genres like comedy versus drama versus dramatic comedy. This play was really interesting because the playwright gave you notes for how to curate the space to reflect the character. So with the character description, it said, maybe her apartment's messy, or like he has abstract art in the background, which is the way that the actors maybe playing these roles or doing this production could kind of be their own set designers and use that medium of a Zoom performance to kind of set up their space to help tell the story as well, which isn't always like an opportunity that we have when we're in a physical theater.
Yes, yeah, see? So that could be for your concluding page.
Yes.
Like different opportunities. So you see the text, if you are like in a rush or you don't want to read through, it gives you bits and snippets, right? So one of the things you might have noticed is that, for example, I was telling Kunjal when we met just before, research in general is like, go find me journals, look at the data, bring the numbers, right? And then I write, and my name is there, might be a footnote, thank you. They are out there. These things are gonna be published in a website or something, or like I still have to figure out what's gonna be the container for these. For now, 3 scalars, right? Sydney's, Lane and Eliza, they had to write curatorial statements, have their writing not be undergraduate research papers, right? So I feel that could, do you want to say something about that? Because that was special, it's different than learn research methodology with a professor. Now here it's like you are contributing to the book.
About the scalar.
Yeah, like having your research out, right? Like it's not just something that is a component of somebody else's that maybe 2 years from now is going to be published. Yeah.
Well, I realize that tap in at any point, but for me, there was kind of the moment of like, we spent a lot of winter quarter looking at various different kinds of performances, and me and Eliza were doing a lot of different things together. And coming into spring quarter, we realized that we had kind of different core questions, and that's when we split off and decided to do separate scalars as opposed to one together. Whereas in the winter, it's like I would be golf and like be looking at stage directions, and she would be thinking about embodiment, but we would still be sharing resources with each other. And there was a world where we did one scalar, and we decided it was better to have 2 more focused scalars than one that was trying to like encapsulate a lot of different topics. But I think
yeah. Oh, you finished. Sorry. No, I was just gonna say, and like generally with this research, like there was a lot of like getting super, super vague and then being like, wait, we have to like put it into a scalar that is going to be images and words and lead you through a path. So I think there's definitely a lot of like material and analysis that we did that isn't necessarily on the scalar, but that is like behind the scenes informed it. But I think, a struggle that we had was just like, Sydney gathered an amazing collection of performances that was like so vast, and just figuring out how to narrow it down and how to really hone in on specific ones was like definitely really, really challenging, but also like that's what you have to do when you want to guide a reader through something and like have them invest in what you're writing. But I think that's also why Sydney's timeline is super useful. Like I feel like Sydney had sort of like a macro scale way of looking at it, and I think like what we did, because it was 2025, was just like hone in on really specific things, and that also forced us to have like specific connections to these performances, figure out what really interested us, which I think also like Professor Fuentes gave us like the agency to be like, choose your favorite ones or the ones that speak to you and then write about it, which I think is also pretty rare when you're like doing research for a professor. It's often like, here's what I need, can you go gather this and give it to me? But I feel like we definitely got the chance to be like, what was interesting to us and what do we want to develop further? So yeah.
So I have 2 more things, and then I want to open it for questions. I want to show this part because this is part of, let's see, Eliza's. So the thing about like, what do you have? um, led to dead links, right?
Mhm.
So she was like, a lot of the artists didn't maintain their websites, right? There's a lot of dead links. And so she did something of that. She created what in Scalar is called the path. And then ended up with like, because I think that you were influenced by me suffering that students were not signing up to the class. I was like, nobody wants to think about the pandemic, you know? So like we were a lot about like memory and forgetting. So she talks about this idea of digital remains, right? Obsolescence and people moving on. But also
Yeah,
like,
I will say also just with those comments, like that's still like in development, but there are just a bunch of comments that we received through the survey. And so, that little one from Professor Nora Power is sorry, I need to add to that. But that's just like one snippet of like taking some comments that we got from the survey and synthesizing that to like match this concept of like, did we all just try to forget it, or do we remember, or do we value it? But it was really interesting going through the list that Sydney collected. Like that screenshot that's at the top of that page is just like every link that I encountered that was like, oops, sorry, you're in the wrong place, which I'm
yeah,
not. They just deleted it. They don't really care to, but also there are added elements to that, which is like it costs money to maintain a website. And thinking about like people don't necessarily think that that's emblematic of the work they do, and they didn't really think there was value in keeping it. So that's interesting too.
yeah, like even, like somebody forgot their lines, the theater people create 401, 404, error pages in the style of theater. And yes, so like a lot of like what this platform enables, that is like, okay, coming back to the title of the share out, this is not a website. There are many ways in which this is a website, but also that it enables them as kind of dramaturgs to craft the experience they want from users or readers, right? So like at some point, Eliza was like, maybe my scalar is going to be like the telelibrary, that people kind of grab by choice. It's prompted to retrieve stuff, right? So this idea of reproducing a performance somehow, right? And then like, what do we do with surveys? So Lane kind of deals with numbers and stuff. She was like, we need to get more surveys. So we had like 15 people answering, right? How is that going to be a cake, But so like we figured out that, Mary says like, this was a thing in itself. There were experiments and we should look at that. And so lastly, because now we have this co-creator, I asked AI to analyze the surveys because, of course, I don't have that skill, and they did, or she did, I don't know. So, like, she identified these trends, what people talk about, what they highlight, drawbacks, interesting comments and tendent trends, like shifting perception on emotional impact, as you see there. She even put these emojis. So that's where we can stop there, right? Like with the new partner. Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lane and Adai. Thank you. So we have 10 minutes for questions from Zoom, like, and even feedback, what is missing, what are you curious about, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Question. First of all, just thank you to all three of you, because both, it's just really exciting to see the work that you're doing, but also it I do think that we try to run from the pandemic, and it throws me back to those early days of quarantine where I was reading some op-ed in like March or April of 2020 about previous pandemics, and it was a historian basically saying, if you look in the years after these pandemics, no one talks about them. right? So like after the Spanish flu pandemic, there's just like, it's not in the literature. It's not like that. It just, after major pandemics, everyone doesn't talk about it because it's so traumatic. And I remember thinking in the midst of quarantine, like, oh, we won't be like that. And then we ran from it as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
So I think projects like this that ask us to really sit with what that moment was and how it's transformed, you know, the things we do from research to performance, it's just really important work. And I guess the question I was thinking about as I was sort of having that retroactive view back to the work that people were doing, and then even thinking, I love the 404 page, right? That's part of the legacy, is this sort of material that disappears. I guess, and you may not have an answer to this, but I'm wondering if you're thinking at all about um, what some of the continuing, if not maybe explicit afterlives of digital performance post-pandemic are. I think we all agreed that we didn't want to be going to a lot of plays that were in Zoom rooms, right? So that genre seemed to die out. But I was just thinking that this morning I was flipping through TikTok and I happened on a clip of a rehearsal in London of the new Evita with Rachel Zegler, which is directed by Jamie Lloyd, which is reproducing the same tactic that they just used for their Sunset Boulevard production, where a major scene from the musical happens outside the theater and then is broadcast back into the theater. So Don't Cry for Me, Argentina now is sung on the balcony of the theater on the outside, and the people in the theater are watching that on a screen. And it occurred to me as I was watching this rehearsal a month before the show opens, that the audience isn't just the people on the street, that is specifically made because people will now show up outside the theater to record Rachel Zegler singing Don't Cry for Me, Argentina every night, which is actually a form of digital performance, right? It's a translation of these kinds of techniques, and wondering like, would that have happened had we not? So that's kind of the question, is like, are you experiencing or tracking the ways in which the techniques and methods that people were developing during the pandemic are playing out in contemporary making, or is that something that you're sort of partitioning while you look at the work that was being made?
No, that's great. Yeah, Eliza.
Oh, I just wanted to say, like, even the fact that you saw that on TikTok, I feel like is so relevant. Like, obviously, I think this could be a whole other project if we talked about just like social media usage post-COVID. And I think, like, yeah, and this might be related to also just Lane's project of like how rapidly things can sort of blow up, or like access and the ability to like publish things in a time when everything's digital. It makes it like there are less loopholes. Like you could post one video and it could get a million views, and like there you go. I don't know. So I guess for me, that's what I would think in terms of like how digital performance relates to like the world we live in today and like the art we create today, is just, yeah, how rapidly things can blow up and how much access we have to like so many different kinds of performance. Like I'll be watching a TikTok of someone dancing and it has 10 likes, and all of a sudden it has like 1 million likes, and then that person's career starts. But I think all that happens because like we developed such an attachment to digital mediums when that's sort of all we had to have access to the world. But I also think even with that, just the idea that just thinking outside of the box in terms of performance, like every artist was forced to do that. I don't think Yannick would have made the telelibrary if we weren't in isolation. And so I think just the way that we like use our brain to think about how to make theater more exciting, like maybe that was bound to happen as theater develops, but maybe just this like online dependence also helped that happen.
Also, something that happened kind of in pop culture as we were doing this was one of my favorite musical artists, Gracie Abrams, and her career, her first tour got shut down, and she would do these Zoom concerts. We'd get the link and you join, and they were called her bedroom shows, and she would play with 100 fans in her bedroom. And now she's selling out the O2 Arena, and she's built a B stage on a picture that looks exactly like her bedroom, with like rocket sheets and kind of all the things that are kind of the symbols of this era that her fans can recognize. But now there's tens of thousands of people surrounding her, and the way it projects as she sits at the piano, and it's the same angle that it would have been if she was filming in her bedroom. So you're watching her perform in the same space as you, while on the screen it's her, because most people are watching the concert on the screen, not because they aren't close enough to her. Still kind of having that live stream as kind of a, call back to her early career. And also kind of, I think, a statement on being like kind of like a bedroom pop star and writing these like personal kind of diary entry songs. But that was just such a cool thing to see. And I don't think that that kind of choice would have ever happened without the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, quickly, the surveys, people, in general, they are like, I don't want to, I never joined digital performance after, Zoom performances, but I'm bummed when something is not hybrid. Like I want to, Fred Moten talks in New York and I can access that lecture. So I think people are very much into like having access, connecting after, yeah. Sorry, Nora?
Thank you all for this presentation. And Sarah, I'm so new to even hearing of Scalar, so just learning about that alone as a tool is really interesting to that I want to learn more about. But sort of building on Josh's question, I was thinking about I'm a dance artist, and so I was based in Brooklyn during the pandemic, and this sort of conversation about what happens to dance, what happens to experimental dance during the lockdown and afterwards. That was a question even before the lockdown. It was definitely something that a lot of us were talking about. And some of the moves that I was seeing a lot of artists make was this shift into the digital or into the film as digital film. So seeing sort of extending where does dance happen and how can dance as experimental art braid more intimately with and a website that's actually a portal that can find a way for people to sort of connect. And this kind of question of how does dance stay relevant? It was something that kind of came up a lot in this digital, in this moment of digital, and then lastly too around access needs. So okay, well then now this is a place where we can actually start to practice what it needs to have folks access art differently, because not everybody is able to come into the theater or even times of day. Most of the shows are in the evening, and some folks with chronic illnesses are not able to come to a show in the evening, things like this. So I guess these are sort of thoughts that are coming up in response, and a question that I have, which again we might not be able to answer, but you started to speak to already, is I'm curious about the relationship, I guess, between archive versus art making on digital platforms, as well as if you're seeing sort of a spike in cross-disciplinarity, maybe in particular as it comes to dance and film or dance and an online platform. Really interested in the telelibrary example as something that you could access as on your own time performances, book this appointment to have this performance. So more comments than questions, but just wanting to move alongside you all with this kind of research.
Yeah, something I was pointed to by Professor DeFrance as another example was, I think it was Kyle Abraham's AIM company. They did this amazing dance film during COVID, and I feel like there was definitely just a spike in concept videos and dance films. And I also know that Lane did a bit of a dive on contact improv and how those kinds of art forms obviously were impossible during COVID. But I think that I guess that points us to some more some losses from digital performance that I think people are now super hungry for. And personally, last summer I went to Berlin and I did B12 Dance Festival, which was amazing. But that was completely contact improv oriented, and it felt like a complete to me that was the one experience I had of oh, we're past the pandemic. I can't even remember a time when this wasn't part of dance. And I feel like that, and that kind of thing is so valuable, and also was just not present during COVID at all. But also I guess the idea of the archive and the ephemeral, even digital mediums like TikTok, they're kind of ephemeral, because even though even though they still exist and you can still go to someone's feed and see that video. Like you only saw it for 1 second and then you keep scrolling. I don't know. Something that like Josh said just made me think about how TikTok is so important to all of this. But I guess that's just another interesting element of it that like the ephemeral might not even refer to just like live performance. It might actually also just refer to like the way we just seem like just mindlessly engage with performance and then move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The 404 is the grave, like we don't have
Yeah.
it in live performance that notice, like you missed it, like, but the 404 is one thing I want to mention is like, so Kunjal, next steps, Kunjal is going to look at more like global south, material and even how the approach changes thematically, what concerns, local, more situated concerns. In my talks with my folks, like folks in Argentina, a lot had a lot to share about teaching on Zoom, right? Teaching and hosting space for like teachers protests, teachers being called to be in person and put at risk. And so the class involved thinking collectively about modes of resistance and things like that. So they were like, what do you mean performance? Can we talk about this as well, and we all know that we were doing everything, on Zoom and these platforms. Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're out of time. Bye, Eliza. Thank you.
Hi,
Thank
Eliza.
you. Thanks for allowing me to be on Zoom. It's such a weird experience. It's like I'm trying to mentally transport myself to it. But thank you. This was so great. Thank you
This
so much,
made the
everyone.
point.
Yeah.
Bye bye. Take
Bye.
care.